I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literary and cultural studies. In this installment, I'll be saying some things about Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 in London, and she died in 1941. She was the daughter of Leslie Stephen, who was the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. This is important because the essay itself has much to do with the history of important people in Great Britain and with the relative absence of women among the group. Being the daughter of an intellectual like Leslie Stephen, Virginia Woolf had encouragements toward learning that most women were not afforded in her time. Though she was mostly self-taught, she had tutors, and she spent some time in a ladies' program at the University of London. Still, it might be said that most of her learning came as a result of her access to her father's library. This essay, A Room of One's Own, was originally written to be presented to a group of women students at Cambridge University. And at the time, 1928, women had only been studying at Cambridge University for about the past 60 years. So these students were relative pioneers in the history of higher education for women. The essay has been widely hailed as a landmark of feminist activism and criticism. Woolf was already a famous novelist. She was noted for her use of methods such as stream of consciousness writing, and also for the depth and nuance with which she represented her characters and the relationships among characters. I will return to these themes as we look at some passages from the essay, but I find the essay especially interesting as well for its hard-nosed analysis of the material conditions faced by women who sought to become educated and to write. Okay, to Virginia Woolf. We've gone from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, and here we are. Virginia Woolf. Literature in English had not been taught in colleges and universities in the early modern era until the 19th century. Students, the male students of those universities, studied Greek and Latin, and they read literary texts in Greek and Latin, but the literary texts they read were incidental to the study of Greek and Latin, and not as literature on its own terms. And literature in English wasn't studied. I think the attitude would have been, why do you need to teach literature in English? Anyone who's at the university and speak English and read and write English, what's to teach? They can read it and either enjoy it or not, as the reader pleases, and there's nothing to teach there. So the study of English literature, in fact, emerges in the context of the admission of women to higher education in the first place. And here in 1928, Woolf is being invited to Cambridge to speak to a group of women students because she's a famous woman novelist. And the essay is an exploration of the material conditions that make writing possible and how those conditions have been withheld from women. She begins by relating what will seem to be a very trivial incident. But as we will see, it's the kind of an incident that, repeated over decades and generations and centuries, has had enormous consequences. She was, she tells the students, sitting on the banks by the river at Cambridge, deep in thought about what she was going to write, what she was going to say. Suddenly, she had a thought that was so striking that it prompted her to get up and to start to walk. Unfortunately for her, she happened to stray absent-mindedly onto the grass, and immediately she was confronted by a beadle, a sort of a security guard, who abruptly informed her that she should walk on the path and not on the grass. Here was Virginia Woolf, the honored, invited guest lecturer, being confronted and reprimanded by a lowly beadle, a man who felt no sense of obligation to defer to the famous novelist. He was a man, she was a woman. It was the disturbance of a mere moment, nothing to bother about, and yet she will return to the incident At the end of the essay, the accumulation and the repetition of such incidents has an effect, she will show us, on the situation of women and the subordination of women historically in our society. I'll read a few lines. Here I was sitting on the banks of a river a week or two ago in fine October weather, lost in thought. That caller I have spoken of, women and fiction, the need of coming to some conclusion on a subject that raises all sorts of prejudices and passions, bowed my head to the ground. That caller she's speaking of now is one that she will develop more fully in describing. It's a metaphorical caller, but it's a problem she'll develop more fully in the second part. And we're going to skip over that today. But in it, she talks about going into the library, you may recall from the video, and searching all of the research on women. And what she finds is that everything written about women was written by men who had really no qualifications at all for writing about women's experience. They not only had no experience of being a woman, they seemed not to have even thought it necessary to talk to a woman, to interview a woman, to find out what women's experience was. They just wrote either from theological authority or their own presumed authority as a man. You know the term mansplaining? Wasn't invented yet, but it's a pretty good word. So she gets up, starts walking across the grass. It was thus I found myself walking with extreme rapidity across a grass plot. Instantly, a man's figure rose to intercept me. Nor did I at first understand that the gesticulations of a curious-looking object in a cutaway coat and evening shirt were aimed at me. His face expressed horror and indignation. Instinct rather than reason came to my help. He was a beetle. I was a woman. This was the turf. There was the path. Only the fellows and scholars are allowed here. The gravel is the place for me. She's being put in her place by a beetle. She's a famous novelist, an upper middle class, highly educated, sophisticated woman, but the beetle, a man, has the institutional authority and the presumed social authority. He has the authority and the responsibility to guard this grass. Such thoughts were the work of a moment. As I regained the path, the arms of the beetle sank. His face assumed its usual repose, and though turf is better walking than gravel, no very great harm was done. How would you describe the process that she's characterizing here or narrating here? What's her attitude about being told to stay off the grass? I'm sorry? Don't want to start a confrontation. We can understand why she doesn't say, don't you understand? I'm the famous novelist. But she doesn't. The consequence of her not doing it, and the consequence, I think she's implying, of women not doing it again and again, day after day, year after year, is that it repeats the taken for granted assumption that any man has authority over any woman, notwithstanding questions of merit or class privilege or anything like that. And she writes this, I think, with a good deal of subtlety and grace in a way that I hope encourages you to think deeply about it. On that point, I'll conclude for now. I'll have more to say about A Room of One's Own in subsequent installment. In the meantime, as always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.